How did James Monroe make a name for himself as a young man? Hi, my name is Jason. Welcome to Founder of the Day. And today we're going to talk about the early life of future President James Monroe. Now, James Monroe came from a fairly wealthy family, but middling for the time and place in Virginia. He was, however, very smart and was able to get into the College of William and Mary. Now, when the American Revolution broke out, Monroe said, I want to go fight. I want to fight in the war. And he dropped out of college. But he was only 17 years old. The thing is, as a man attending college, he was well read and well spoken and very intelligent. And because he could read very well, he was sought after for his brain more than anything. And while most 17-year-olds would just go and join the war and serve as a private, Monroe was fortunate that his uncle, Joseph Jones, was in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And his uncle used connections in the government to get Monroe appointed as a lieutenant at just 17 years old. What's interesting about Monroe in particular being appointed a lieutenant is who he served under. His colonel was Thomas Marshall, who was the father of Monroe's future rival, John Marshall, who of course would be a long-time Chief Justice of the United States years in the future. And the captain of his outfit was William Washington, who himself was a cousin of Commander-in-Chief George Washington. So these were obviously good connections to make in the first place. They go to war, and it turns out that Monroe serves at the Battle of Princeton, and he is actually wounded when, as is William Washington. They both make a break into the center of town to retrieve some cannons from the enemy, and they're both pretty severely wounded. Monroe actually is hit in the shoulder and almost bleeds to death at 17, 18 years old. And fortunately, after a few months of recuperation, he was able to regain his health, and he was chosen to go to Virginia, where he attempted to recruit a new unit for him to lead. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have been very good at this. It was probably a hard sell for him to say to so many older men, hey, come fight underneath me. Additionally, like I said earlier, Monroe didn't really have the personal wealth that most higher-ranking officers in the Continental Army had. So it would have been, clearly it was very difficult for him to try and say, hey, I'll pay you out of my own pocket, as many generals and other leaders did. So he gives up on this, but he is recruited himself to serve as an aide-de-camp to Major General Lord Sterling, who I will give a video to, the only American Major General who claimed to be a nobleman, but that is a different story entirely. He does serve for several years as an aide-de-camp for Sterling, including at the Battle of Monmouth. He is, as an aide-de-camp, one of his major responsibilities would be stay back on the battlefield with the Major General, and when orders were given, go out on horseback and tell everyone what the orders were. You couldn't call it in at the time. Now granted, eventually Monroe wants a field command, as many of these young men trying to prove themselves did. So he is permitted to go down to North Carolina, where for a second time he attempts to recruit people to fight underneath him, and for a second time he fails to meet his numbers. And this is pretty much where he says, at this point, 5 years has elapsed. He has been at war for 5 years. He's now only 22 years old, but a veteran of 5 years of serious warfare. And this is right about the time of the Battle of Yorktown, so Monroe says enough is enough, and he goes into begin to start studying law. And from here on out, I shouldn't say he goes into private practice. He does for a bit, but he would obviously have a much longer career after this. But he goes to study law under Governor Thomas Jefferson. And this, as you might imagine, begins a long friendship and collaboration between the two future presidents. I will say, while he's studying under Jefferson, he does several times go down south to act as kind of a proto-war correspondent. He just goes to see what's going on and send that information back to Mr. Thomas Jefferson, letting him know what's happening, because as governor of Virginia, the largest state, the most populated state, and the wealthiest state, Jefferson needed to know what was going on all over the place, as did Patrick Henry and the many other people who served. Well, I guess I shouldn't say many. The few other people who served as governor of Virginia in and around the Revolutionary War. And of course, so that's the basic start. That's how Monroe makes his way up. From there, as you may know, Monroe goes on to do many great things. He runs and loses against James Madison for the inaugural United States House of Representatives, but the following 2 years later becomes a senator. He serves as governor himself of Virginia. He acts as a diplomat in both the United Kingdom and in France, and it's often overlooked. James Monroe rather, was one of the two people who literally negotiated, and then signed the Louisiana Purchase on behalf of the United States. Thomas Jefferson gets a lot of credit for that, but it was Monroe and Robert Livingston in France who actually made the purchase. And then, of course, Monroe would come back, serve as Secretary of State and Secretary of War for James Madison. Those names, they're too similar. And last but not least, he would become President of the United States and serve for 8 years under the era of good feeling. And what is also overlooked often about James Monroe is he really ran for his second term as the incumbent candidate. He ran unopposed. We like to say that George Washington was elected unanimously, but James Monroe ran unopposed. There were Federalist candidates who were presented, but when it really comes down to brass tacks, it was just like, okay, James, we've had 16, 20, 5 terms, was that 20 years of Virginian presidents? Take 4 more. So that in a nutshell is the life of James Monroe. Please let me know what your favorite thing about James Monroe is. Leave me a comment. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you can always see more videos when I put them up. And I look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you.